Alright, let me just say this first. I love Elden Ring. I unironically think it's one of the best games of all time. The application of the FromSoft formula of tight action RPG combat into a beautiful and full open world is outstanding, to say the least. But the game is not perfect. No game is. I recently finished Myth Wukong, including the post-game and the secret ending, and I absolutely loved it. Now, do I think Wukong is a better game than Elden Ring overall? No. I think Elden Ring is much more complete as a game, but there is one important aspect of both games that, in my opinion, Wukong is superior in, and that aspect is boss design. I'm just gonna come out and say it, the boss quality in Wukong is undeniably better than Elden Ring, and you can crucify me for that all you want, but at least let me make my point first. There are over 90 bosses in Myth Wukong. The exact amount varies depending on how you want to classify each unique boss, so you do fight some of the bosses several times. According to the website Rock Paper Shotgun, the game has 100 bosses. Regardless, this is a massive amount for this size of game. It took me about 45 hours to finish the main story, and about 5 hours more to go find all the bosses that I missed. That is a very high boss density. For reference, according to the same website, the base game of Elden Ring has a staggering 238 bosses counting all types. So yes, even those shitty end of dungeon bosses that are basically reskins of normal enemies, it's probably going to take an average person around 100 to 120 hours of gameplay to go through all optional areas and beat all major bosses in Elden Ring. So going off of my playtime, we're looking at a boss density in Myth Wukong of about 2 bosses per hour of playtime, versus a boss density of about 2.2 bosses per hour of playtime in Elden Ring. That is to say that both games have an extremely similar boss density. For another reference, look at Dark Souls 2, which before Elden Ring was touted as having way too many bosses for its size. Dark Souls 2 has a measly 32 bosses in the base game and takes about the same time to beat as Myth Wukong, meaning it has a third of the boss density. Jesus, I don't agree when people call Wukong a boss rush game, but I kinda see where they're coming from. Anyway, both Myth Wukong and Elden Ring have similar boss densities, but Wukong's bosses feel much more unique and, well, fun. It feels as if with a lot of Elden Ring bosses, the devs are constantly asking themselves, is this boss hard enough before putting it into the game? But with Myth Wukong, it feels as if the devs are asking themselves, is this boss fun enough? Not every boss in Myth Wukong is particularly hard. In fact, a lot of bosses are fairly easy, and an action RPG veteran will probably beat them on the first try. Now, that's not to say that the game doesn't offer challenging bosses. It does, especially towards the endgame. But I think the devs are much more focused on making a boss fight fun and unique, instead of making it as brutal as possible. And of course, I'm not saying Elden Ring doesn't have unique bosses. It absolutely does. Starscourge Radahn, Godric the Crafted, Praetor Rykard, all fun bosses with unique designs. But overall, more bosses in Wukong are unique than in Elden Ring. You fight a giant beetle that burrows and attacks from underground, frogs that headbutt you with their actual butts, an actual mountain. Also, a lot more bosses in Myth Wukong have gimmicks, and I mean this in the best way possible. Gimmick bosses are a sort of sensitive topic for FromSoft fans. A lot of them don't like gimmick bosses, and that's understandable since a lot of FromSoft gimmick bosses f***ing suck. But I don't think this means that gimmick bosses are bad by default. I just think that FromSoft needs to put a bit more effort into designing gimmick bosses that actually work with the flow of the game, instead of forcing you to platform in a game where your character can roll like a commando officer, but is unable to jump higher than a goddamn sidewalk. Good gimmick bosses can be a lot of fun, and Myth Wukong proves that. Now, let's talk about reskins and repeating bosses. In a game with a lot of bosses, it's only natural that you're going to be fighting the same bosses several times. Both games do this. Let's talk about Elden Ring first. A staggering 143 boss fights, at least that I personally counted, are repeated, meaning that these boss fights happen in almost the same fashion, mechanically speaking, anywhere from 2 times to, I think 9 times you fight the Knight's Cavalry or something. So at least 60% of the boss fights in the game are not unique. I say at least because it's perfectly possible that I missed some fights when I was researching for this video. And yes, in case you were wondering, I did count the field dragons as the same bosses, because why wouldn't I? They're basically the same boss with a different element. As well as Margit, Morgoth, and the 2 Mohg fights. They are similar enough to be considered repeat fights, and I don't care what anybody says. Furthermore, at least 34 boss fights, or 14%, are variants of normal enemies in Elden Ring. And yes, they do overlap with the repeating boss fights. Now let's compare these numbers with Black Myth Wukong. Wukong has at least 25 repeating boss fights, or 25% of the total boss fights. Now let me clarify something. When I say repeating boss fights, what I actually mean is effectively a boss fight that is mechanically very similar to another boss fight, whether or not the boss itself has the same name both times. This is why I consider Margit and Morgoth repeating fights in Elden Ring, even though their names are technically different. And yes, I know they're the same person, but you get the point. So even this 25% is debatable in Wukong. For example, I consider the first two fights with the Macaque Chief repeating because they play out very similarly, but the third fight feels and plays out much more differently, so I don't count it even though it's technically the same boss. But even the ones that I do consider repeating, like the frog bosses for example, actually still feel different enough to keep me entertained, with each frog boss having unique moves that give a different feel to the fight. As far as normal enemy variants, I found 9 bosses, or 9% of the total boss fights. So Black Myth Wukong overall has far less repeating bosses, relatively speaking, and less bosses that are simply variants of existing enemies compared to Elden Ring. And that's not a shock at all. Black Myth Wukong is a far smaller game, and thus the devs had more time and resources to pour into making more unique and fun bosses, as opposed to Elden Ring, which had to stretch itself thin, making a huge open world and then having to populate that world with tons of bosses. Now, you can give a pass to Elden Ring for everything up to this point. Having more repeatable bosses, having more bosses that are normal enemy variants, not having so many unique bosses that shake up gameplay. I can very easily excuse all of these flaws by taking into account the sheer size of the game. In fact, you can argue with me that Elden Ring bosses are better than Black Myth Wukong for whatever reason, and I wouldn't even be mad. But there is one aspect of boss fights that Black Myth Wukong is so vastly superior in that even daring to suggest otherwise should count as a Class A felony. And this aspect is gank bosses. Gank boss fights are basically fights where you fight 2+ enemies at the same time. And Elden Ring loves its gank boss fights, having at least 15 of them in the base game, more if you also throw in bosses that summon adds like Commanded Nio. Now, like gimmick boss fights, gank fights aren't something that is usually well received in the Souls community. After all, the bread and butter of the games is tight one-to-one combat. Gank fights oftentimes feel frustrating and unfair, until you inevitably give up and summon your mimic. Which brings me neatly into my point. The gank boss fights in Elden Ring are awful, at least most of them. It very much feels like FromSoft has given no thought whatsoever to making gank bosses have some sort of nice synergy and reasoning behind them. It really feels as though they just took 2 bosses that worked fine enough on their own, threw them both in an arena and told you to deal with them. The prime example of this is one of the most hated fights in the entire series, the Godskin duo. I actually enjoy fighting the Godskins individually, they're pretty fun bosses, but putting them together in an arena and asking you to fight them both at the same time is a prime example of FromSoft's colossal failure to create interesting multi-bosses. These guys do not work well as a double boss. You'd expect the skinny one to be faster and more agile, while the fat one would be hanging back, dealing slower but heavier attacks, giving you some breathing room to deal with the skinny one first. But nope, Fatty is actually more agile than the skinny one. And that doesn't mean that the skinny one is slow, by the way. Even if you do manage to tear down one of them, you'll only get a brief respite, as the other one will summon them back in half a minute. Your best bet is to quickly kill the other one before they get a chance to revive their comrade, after which the first dude that died will automatically respawn and then rinse and repeat. And the worst part of this boss fight is that it's actually mandatory. You have to fight this boss in order to beat the game, meaning that on repeat runs you have to fight this boss every single time. And yes, I know that you can cheese them by putting them to sleep, or that the fight's much easier with a summon, but in my mind these don't count as excuses. This is a terribly designed boss fight with very little care given to balance it. Now, I don't know the actual effect that Spirit Ashes had on the terrible design of gank bosses in Elden Ring. I can't say for certain that FromSoft used Spirit Ashes as an excuse to not pay that much attention to creating engaging 2 versus 1 fights, and rather just bet on the fact that players would summon, making them effectively 2 versus 2 fights instead, but I do think it played somewhat of a role. Hell, it's not like FromSoft doesn't know how to make good gank bosses. Remember Ornstein and Smaug? Regardless, the gank fights in Elden Ring are average at best with Spirit Dash and atrocious at worst if you're not summoning or using cheese strategies. Now let's compare that with Black Myth Wukong's gank fights. I only remember 6 multi-bosses in Black Myth Wukong, as well as some more bosses plus ads fights, usually with the field bosses that are enemy variants. Now the boss plus mobs fights are nothing special, except the Commander Beetle one that has like 2 billion ads. What the f***, game science? However, the actual multi-bosses are leaps and bounds better than the Elden Ring ones for one very simple reason. They are designed explicitly as multi-bosses. Multi-bosses in Black Myth Wukong have unique mechanics that make them fun to fight as a duo, while also balancing out the fights. I don't want to spoil too much here, but if you played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Duo bosses will typically attack you one at a time, or have specific combo attacks that you can learn and then avoid, giving you plenty of chance to fight back once you figure out the patterns. There wasn't a single instance where I felt that gank bosses were being unfair. In fact, some duo bosses are actually some of my favorite fights in the game. And again, this stems from the fact that Game Science obviously designed these boss fights with the explicit purpose of them being gank fights, rather than taking 2 bosses that are clearly meant to be fought one-on-one and then putting them together. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you think about it, it kinda makes sense that Black Myth Wukong would have an easier time achieving higher boss quality than Elden Ring. For starters, the game is smaller, and even with similar boss density, the absolute amount of bosses is still less than half of that of Elden Ring. Black Myth Wukong is a mostly linear mission-type game, while Elden Ring is open and expansive, meaning it has to pour more resources into its world, resources that could have been allocated for better bosses if the game was smaller and more linear. Lastly, Black Myth Wukong's combat is standardized. While there are some builds you can make with different curios and weapons or spells, at the end of the day, all players are going to be engaging in combat in a fairly similar fashion. To the contrary, Elden Ring has to deal with a ton of different builds and also with Spirit Dashes, which do affect the boss fights by a huge margin. And this video shouldn't come as a surprise to a lot of players, especially veteran Souls players. Elden Ring doesn't have the best image if we're talking about boss quality alone in the Souls community. While almost everybody agrees that most of the major bosses are great, the overall boss quality is being pulled down a lot by all of the things we mentioned before. What I can't excuse Elden Ring for is the awful multi-bosses. Do not take 2 bosses that are made to be fought one-on-one and pit them in the same arena. That is just lazy design. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more Souls and Souls-like videos. Peace.